I handed her the folder in the living room of the house she'd been so desperate to sell. My sister-in-law Rebecca stood there in her expensive blazer and designer heels, that practiced smile frozen on her face as she reached for it. She thought it was property documents. She thought she'd finally won. When she opened it and saw the first page, all the color drained from her face. Her hands started shaking. She looked up at me, and I saw something I'd never seen before in Rebecca's eyes. Fear, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Catherine, and this happened about 30 years ago, when I was in my early 30s. I'd been married to Daniel for 5 years, and we lived a quiet, simple life in Millbrook, a small town about an hour outside of Pittsburgh. I worked as a librarian at the local library. Daniel was a high school science teacher, and we were happy. We didn't have much money, but we had each other, and that was enough. Daniel's mother, Helen, lived alone in the old family house on Maple Street after her husband passed. She was 72, sharp as a tack, independent, and fiercely proud. The house was a beautiful Victorian that had been in the family for 3 generations. Helen loved that house more than anything. Daniel had an older brother, Robert, who'd moved to Philadelphia years ago. Robert was a surgeon, very successful, very busy. He rarely came home to visit. He'd married Rebecca about 2 years before my story begins, and from the moment I met her, I knew something was off. Rebecca was a real estate agent in Philadelphia, one of those high-powered types who wore power suits and talked on her car phone constantly. She was beautiful in a cold, calculated way. Everything about her was polished and perfect and utterly fake. The first time she visited Millbrook, she walked through Helen's house, like she was doing an appraisal. I watched her run her finger along the mantelpiece, check the corners for dust, peer into rooms with this critical eye. When we sat down for dinner, she said to Helen, "This house is far too big for you now, don't you think? All these stairs. So much maintenance." Helen had smiled politely and changed the subject, but I saw the hurt in her eyes. Over the next year, Rebecca's visits became more frequent, and her suggestions became more insistent. She'd bring brochures for active senior communities and assisted living facilities. She'd talk about how dangerous it was for Helen to live alone, how she might fall, how she couldn't possibly manage the upkeep. The thing was, Helen was doing just fine. She had arthritis in her knees, sure, but she got around. She had friends. She volunteered at the church. She kept a small garden. She was living her life. But Rebecca wouldn't let it go. And Robert, well, Robert just went along with whatever Rebecca said. He was always too busy to have an opinion of his own. Daniel and I lived just 10 minutes from Helen. I'd stop by almost every day after work, help her with groceries, have tea, keep her company. I loved my mother-in-law. She'd welcomed me into the family with open arms, never judged me for being a small-town librarian with no fancy degree, never made me feel less than. We'd sit in her kitchen for hours, talking about books and gardens and life. Things really started to escalate when Helen turned 74. Rebecca showed up for her birthday with Robert, and during dinner, she announced that they'd been researching options and had found a wonderful nursing home in Philadelphia. "It's near us," Rebecca said, cutting her cake with precision. "So we can visit regularly. And Catherine and Daniel, you two could visit on weekends." "It makes so much more sense than Helen rattling around in this big old house." "I don't rattle," Helen said quietly. "And I'm not going anywhere." Rebecca's smile tightened. "Mother Helen, be reasonable. You're not getting any younger. What if something happens? What if you fall and no one finds you for days?" "I have friends who check on me. Catherine visits daily. I have a life here, Rebecca. But think of how much easier it would be." I said no. Helen's voice was firm, but I could see her hands trembling slightly as she set down her fork. The subject was dropped, but only temporarily. Over the next few months, Rebecca called Helen constantly, and these weren't friendly daughter-in-law calls. I know because Helen started confiding in me. She called 3 times yesterday. Helen told me one afternoon as we sat on her porch. Kept telling me I'm being stubborn and difficult. Said I'm being selfish, making everyone worry. "Catherine, I'm not ready to leave my home. Is that selfish?" "Of course not," I said, taking her hand. "This is your home. You have every right to stay as long as you want." But Rebecca was relentless. She started sending Robert to talk to Daniel, trying to get him to pressure his mother. Daniel refused. He could see how happy his mother was in her own home, how much it meant to her. That's when Rebecca changed tactics. She started visiting Helen alone when Robert was working. I didn't know this at first. Helen didn't tell me everything right away because she didn't want to cause trouble in the family. But I started noticing changes. Helen seemed more anxious, more withdrawn. She'd startle easily. Once, I came by and found her crying in her bedroom. "What's wrong?" I asked, sitting beside her on the bed. She wiped her eyes quickly. "Oh, nothing. I'm just being silly." "Helen, please. Talk to me." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Rebecca was here yesterday. She said some things. Hurtful things." "What kind of things?" She said, I'm being a burden. That Daniel's career is suffering because he's always worried about me. That I'm being cruel, clinging to this house when I should be thinking about my son's futures. She said the house is worth a lot of money, and I'm sitting on it like a selfish old woman while my sons struggle. I felt anger rising in my chest. Daniel and I aren't struggling. We're perfectly fine. And you're not a burden. She also said. Helen's voice dropped to almost a whisper. She said that if I really loved my family, I'd do what's best for everyone, not just myself. That was the first time I realized how manipulative Rebecca was being. This wasn't about Helen's safety or comfort, this was about something else. But I wasn't sure what yet. The visits continued. Rebecca would show up unannounced, stay for hours, and leave Helen in tears. She'd criticize the state of the house, point out every little thing that needed repair, make Helen feel inadequate and guilty. I started coming by more often, trying to be there when Rebecca visited, but she'd always show up on days when I was working. It was like she was timing it deliberately. Then came the day everything changed. The day of the violation I'll never forget. I'd stopped by Helen's house on my lunch break to drop off some library books she'd requested. When I walked in the back door, which I always did, calling out a hello, I heard voices in the living room. Rebecca's voice, sharp and cruel. I froze in the kitchen, and what I heard made my blood run cold. "Look at yourself, Helen. Look at this house. You can barely climb the stairs. You can't keep up with the cleaning. The garden's a mess. You're falling apart, and you're too stubborn and stupid to admit it." "I'm doing my best." Helen's voice was small, defeated. "Your best isn't good enough anymore. You're embarrassing the family. Do you know what people say? Poor Robert and Daniel, stuck with that stubborn old mother who won't accept reality. You're making everyone miserable because you're too selfish to let go. Rebecca, please. And frankly, Helen, I'm tired of pretending. You're not capable of living independently anymore. Every day you stay here is a day you're putting yourself in danger and making your sons look like neglectful children. Is that what you want? You want people to think Robert and Daniel don't take care of their mother?" I heard Helen crying, soft, broken sobs that shattered my heart. "I've been more than patient," Rebecca continued, her voice like ice. "But my patience has run out. Robert and I are going to make the decision for you since you're clearly not mentally competent to make it yourself. We've already started looking at facilities. You'll be moved by the end of the month." "You can't do that. This is my house." Rebecca laughed. Actually laughed. "Is it though? Can you really afford the taxes, the maintenance? How long before you fall behind and lose it anyway? At least this way, you'll have somewhere safe to go. Unless you'd rather end up homeless when the bank takes it." I couldn't listen anymore. I walked into the living room, and both women looked up at me. Helen's face was streaked with tears. Rebecca's expression shifted instantly to that practiced smile. "Catherine, what a surprise. I was just having a little chat with Mother Helen about her living situation." "I heard your chat," I said coldly. "I think you should leave now, Rebecca." Her eyes narrowed. "This is family business. I am family, and what you're doing is cruel. What I'm doing is trying to help a confused old woman see reason, but I wouldn't expect you to understand. You don't have the same level of responsibility that Robert and I have." She gathered her purse and walked to the door, but before she left, she turned back to Helen. "Think about what I said. You have 2 weeks to decide, or the decision will be made for you." After she left, I held Helen while she cried. She felt so small and fragile in my arms, and I made a promise to myself right then. Rebecca wasn't going to win this, not while I had breath in my body. That night, I told Daniel everything I'd witnessed. He was furious, wanted to call Robert immediately, but I asked him to wait. I had an idea forming, but I needed time to think it through. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. I noticed that Rebecca was picking up Helen's mail sometimes. I noticed that Helen seemed confused about her finances, mentioned bills she didn't remember receiving. So I started asking Helen careful questions. Could I help her organize her paperwork? Did she need assistance with anything? Would she mind if I looked through some of her financial documents, just to make sure everything was in order? Helen, sweet trusting Helen, said yes. She was grateful for the help. She admitted she'd been feeling overwhelmed lately, that Rebecca had been helping her with some banking things, and it was all very confusing. That's when I found it. The first irregularity. Helen had a savings account she'd built up over years from her late husband's pension and Social Security. It should have had about $45,000 in it. When I looked at the most recent statement, there was less than $20,000. I started going through everything: bank statements, checkbooks, receipts, and I found withdrawal after withdrawal, $1,500 here, $2,000 there, all signed with Helen's signature, but Helen didn't remember making any of them. Rebecca helped me sign some papers, Helen said when I asked. She said it was for property tax payments and home repairs. She's been so helpful, taking care of all that complicated financial stuff for me. My hands were shaking as I held those statements. Rebecca had been stealing from Helen, and she'd been doing it for months, maybe longer. I made copies of everything, every statement, every withdrawal slip, every check. I kept the originals with Helen and took my copies home. Then I started making phone calls. I called the bank where Helen had her accounts. I spoke to a manager I knew from the library, told her my concerns about potential elder financial abuse. She couldn't give me detailed information due to privacy laws, but she confirmed that someone other than Helen had been making most of the recent transactions, authorized by a power of attorney. Power of attorney. Rebecca had somehow gotten Helen to sign over power of attorney. I dug deeper. I found the document, buried in a stack of papers Rebecca had brought over for Helen to sign. It was dated 6 months earlier. Helen didn't remember signing it. She probably thought it was something else. Rebecca had tricked her. Then I discovered something even worse. Rebecca had been making inquiries about selling the house. She'd had it appraised. She'd contacted real estate attorneys about the process of selling property owned by someone in diminished capacity. She was planning to have Helen declared mentally incompetent, move her into a facility against her will, and sell the house out from under her. And with the power of attorney and the money she'd already stolen, she was building a case that Helen couldn't manage her own affairs. It was calculated, methodical, and absolutely evil. I spent every spare moment gathering evidence. I got statements from Helen's friends attesting to her mental sharpness. I got letters from her doctor confirming she was of sound mind. I documented every cruel thing Rebecca had said, every manipulation, every theft, and I kept it all in a folder. A plain manila folder that I kept locked in my desk at home. Meanwhile, Rebecca's campaign intensified. She started showing up with social workers, trying to get them to evaluate Helen. She told neighbors that she was worried about Helen's safety, creating a narrative of a confused, endangered old woman. Helen was falling apart. The stress was making her actually unwell. She wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating properly. I watched this vibrant woman I loved wither under Rebecca's constant assault, and it took everything in me not to confront Rebecca directly. But I knew I needed to be smart about this. I needed to wait for the right moment. That moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Rebecca called a family meeting at Helen's house. She wanted Robert, Daniel, Helen, and me all there. She said it was time to make some final decisions about Mother Helen's care and living situation. I brought my folder. We all sat in Helen's living room, the same room where I'd overheard Rebecca's cruelty months before. Rebecca had a briefcase full of documents, brochures for nursing homes, forms for Helen to sign. "I think we all know why we're here," Rebecca began, her voice taking on that practiced, sympathetic tone. "We love Mother Helen, and we want what's best for her. But we have to face facts. She's no longer capable of living independently. I've taken the liberty of researching several excellent facilities." "No," Helen said quietly. "I've told you, I'm not going." Rebecca's smile tightened. "Mother Helen, you're not thinking clearly. That's why we're all here, to help you see reason. She sees perfectly clearly, I said. In fact, Helen's mental clarity is remarkable for someone who's been under so much stress. Rebecca turned to me with barely concealed irritation. Catherine, with all due respect, you don't have the full picture here. You don't know what Robert and I have been dealing with. Actually, I think I have a very complete picture. I opened my folder. For instance, I know that over the past 8 months, $26,000 has been withdrawn from Helen's savings account. Withdrawals that Helen doesn't remember authorizing. The room went silent. Rebecca's face went white. I also know, I continued, pulling out documents, that you obtained power of attorney through deception, had this house appraised without Helen's knowledge, and have been systematically working to have her declared incompetent so you can sell her home and control her assets. That's ridiculous, Rebecca said, but her voice wavered. I've been helping Mother Helen manage her finances because she's too confused to do it herself. Really? Because I have statements here from her doctor, her friends, and her pastor, all confirming that Helen is of completely sound mind. What she is emotionally abused and manipulated by someone she trusted. I laid out the evidence, page by page. Bank records with Rebecca's signatures, emails to real estate attorneys, the fraudulent power of attorney document, records of visits from social workers that Rebecca had arranged under false pretenses. Robert had gone pale. He was looking at Rebecca like he'd never seen her before. You told me Mom was forgetting things, he said slowly. You said she was getting confused, that you were just helping her keep track of her finances. I was helping, Rebecca started. You were stealing, Daniel cut in, his voice hard. From my mother, from a 74-year-old woman. This is a misunderstanding, Rebecca said, standing up. Catherine, you have no idea what you're talking about. You've misinterpreted. I've misinterpreted nothing. I pulled out the final document. This is a complaint I've prepared for the district attorney's office, detailing financial elder abuse. I also have a copy ready to file with the Pennsylvania Department of Aging. All it needs is Helen's signature. I turned to my mother-in-law. Helen, it's your choice. You can sign this, and we'll pursue legal action. Or if you want to handle this within the family, that's your decision too. But either way, Rebecca's power of attorney is being revoked today, and every penny she stole is being returned. Helen looked at Rebecca for a long moment. Then she reached for the pen I offered and signed the complaint. Rebecca's carefully constructed facade crumbled completely. She started yelling, saying we'd all regret this, that we were senile and stupid and she'd been trying to help. Robert just sat there, looking devastated. The aftermath came quickly. The DA's office took the case seriously. Rebecca was charged with financial exploitation of an elderly person. She made restitution, paying back the stolen money plus damages. She pled guilty to avoid jail time, but she got probation, community service, and a permanent record. Her real estate career was over. No one wants an agent who steals from elderly clients. Robert divorced her within the year. He apologized to Helen, to Daniel, to me. He'd been so busy with work, so trusting of his wife, that he hadn't seen what was happening. He started coming home more often, rebuilding his relationship with his mother. Helen lived in her beloved house for another 12 years, happy, independent, surrounded by friends and family. Daniel and I eventually moved into the downstairs when she turned 85, and she lived upstairs where she could hear the sounds of her grandchildren playing. When she finally passed at 86, she died in her own bed, in her own home, exactly as she'd wanted. The house is mine and Daniel's now. Our children grew up here, and someday our grandchildren will play in the same rooms where I once found Helen crying. Sometimes I think about that folder, about the moment I handed it to Rebecca, how her face changed when she realized she'd been caught, how she'd underestimated the quiet librarian who loved her mother-in-law enough to fight back. People like Rebecca, they count on good people staying quiet. They count on victims being too scared or too polite to speak up. They use family loyalty and social pressure as weapons, making people feel like they'd be causing trouble by defending themselves. But here's what I learned. Sometimes causing trouble is exactly what's necessary. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be silent in the face of cruelty. Documentation, evidence, truth, those were my weapons, and they were more powerful than Rebecca's manipulation and lies. Helen taught me that too, in her own way. Even when she was at her lowest, being torn down by someone who should have cherished her, she never lost her essential dignity. She just needed someone to stand beside her and say, "Enough." So that's what I did. I handed Rebecca that folder and said, "Enough." And it was.